Today on Pilot's Discretion, we're joined by pilot and magazine editor Matt Thurber. He talks about new flight control technology, learning to fly helicopters, and hunting swordfish from a Super Cub. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hello, pilots. I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our complete archive. And send us an email with your comments or guest ideas at podcast@sporties.com. Today, my guest is Matt Thurber, a man who has been around the aviation media world about as long as anyone. After graduating from Embry-Riddle, he worked as an A&P mechanic, taught at his father's flight school, and for over 18 years, he has worked for Aviation International News, the last 7 as editor-in-chief. In addition to his writing, Matt is an ATP and flight instructor with multiple jet type ratings. While some names may be better known in aviation media, I'm not sure there is a more knowledgeable journalist working today. So Matt, great to have you on Pilot's Discretion.
Thanks, John. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
You and I were trading emails recently about flight control technology, which seems like a somewhat obscure subject, but I think it's actually quite important. We've seen GA have a bit of a revolution in avionics over the last 2 decades with glass cockpits and autopilots and data link weather. More recently, we've seen some progress with power plants. We're starting to see some electric airplanes take to the sky, but we really haven't seen any progress in the way of how you fly an airplane or a helicopter. They're just hard to fly, I think, for most people when they first start learning. But you recently got to fly a simulator, I know, from Skyrise, a startup that is developing a completely new approach to flight controls, combines everything into one stick and a couple of touchscreens. So tell us briefly about that, and then explain why you think that might be a big deal.
So this was a fascinating introduction to their concept, and what they're trying to accomplish is to make any aircraft easy to fly so that a lot more people can fly them. And when I flew their simulator in El Segundo, California a couple weeks ago, I was pleasantly surprised to see that they're doing what they said they want to do. Their first aircraft is a turbine Robinson R-66 helicopter. And it's funny, when you walk into their lobby, the first thing they show you is 2 big display cases full of all the stuff they removed from the helicopter. And it's push rods and bell cranks and the cyclic and collective and pedals, just a ton of stuff, and replaced it with their fly-by-wire flight control system. But unlike a lot of efforts at modern flight control, they're not just replacing the existing controls with fly-by-wire electronic controls. They wanted to figure out how to make the aircraft easier to fly. So the pilot interface it's called the Skyrise One Helicopter, is a single control stick and 2 touchscreen displays. That's it. Just an example of the simplicity is when you start the engine, you do so on one of the touch screens by just sliding a little slider that says start engine. And that's it. It's all automatically taken care of and controlled. You don't have to get the fuel on at the right time to prevent blowing up the engine or worry about shutting it down if something goes wrong. But when I started flying this machine, I was more than pleasantly surprised at how easy it was. And basically what this flight control system lets you do is fly the helicopter in helicopter ways. In other words, you can still do everything you want to do with it, but you don't have a cyclic, you don't have a collective, and you don't have pedals. All you have is the stick. Now, the stick is a fairly simple design, simpler than anything I've seen even in some of these new eVTOL aircraft. The stick lets you move forward or back or side to side, but as they describe it, what you're really doing is asking for some kind of speed in a direction. So, for example, if you push the stick forward, it's going to keep you level, but it's going to add speed depending on how much you push the stick forward. So if you just tap it, you'll go forward by like 1 or 2 knots. You could tap it forward, tap it backward, sideways. If you want to yaw the helicopter, again, it keeps it perfectly level and you just twist the stick to one side or the other. Now, if you want to go up or down, there's a little thumb control and you just push it up to go up, down to go down. That's all there is to it. It's extremely simple, super intuitive. Took me just minutes to adapt to. But again, the beauty of it is that I can still do all the helicopter stuff. I can put it right where I want it. I can turn in any direction, fly in any direction. And it does all this while keeping the helicopter within any limitations or the flight envelope. So I don't have to worry about doing something that you're not supposed to do. For example, if I want to land, all I have to do is from a hover, which again is automatic, push the thumb switch down and I can push it down as hard as I want. And it will descend and land smoothly. Even if I push the thumb switch down hard to descend quickly, it still takes care of everything at the last few feet. So it's an impressive piece of work, and I'm hoping to get a deeper look at the helicopter and how the actual flight controls are all connected and work.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. There, one of the most impressive demonstrations to me is they did a fully automated auto rotation, a maneuver that most helicopter pilots would say is one of the more challenging things you do during helicopter training, but something the company pulled off last year, which to me shows it's more than just normal flying. It extends to some of those abnormals, which is a bit of a change. A lot of times, the flight control system we're used to, even if the good autopilots, when things really get hairy, it tends to say, your airplane, good luck. And in this case, the controls take it all the way through. So there's obviously a safety angle there that this type of simple control and even flying through emergencies like an auto rotation, that could make flying safer, which would be great. But how about just the ease of use? You know, we talk about what would make general aviation more popular among the wider public. We talk about cost. We talk about the safety issue, which I think is important. But what do you think the impact would be of actually just making the flying process dramatically easier?
I think that's a significant aspect of this flight control system. And again, that's kind of what Skyrise is trying to accomplish, is to make it so that it's not normal for general aviation airplanes to crash. And we crash hundreds of airplanes every year, and for the same reasons over and over. The opportunity, I think there's a lot of people who would love to fly if they didn't have to go through the fairly significant steps that we have to learn to fly safely. And everything about what Skyrise is doing is focused on a safe outcome. It's not a joyride. They're not trying to just make it so anybody can fly, but they're making it so people who really do want to fly could fly safely with far less instruction required. And this kind of gets at the complexity of modern aircraft and flight control systems. We have some amazing automation in our aircraft, but very little of it has done anything to change the basic way we fly aircraft. And so we still make the same mistakes, and sometimes they're amplified by the automation.
Now, I'm sure there's some listeners here who are saying this all sounds great as long as the computer keeps working. But what about when the computer goes haywire? Is there a manual mode? How do I make sure the human is still in the loop here? What's the Skyrise approach there?
That's a good question. I need to ask them about a manual mode, but it's a triple redundant computer system. So and given the amount of stuff that's been taken out in terms of the existing controls, I'm not so sure manual is an opportunity. But then again, none of these eVTOL aircraft are going to have any kind of manual reversion mode either. And I suspect we're going to have to get over wanting that.
What's the certification likelihood here? You cover a lot of new aircraft projects, from engines to airframes. A lot of companies launch with bold visions about certifying quickly. It does look like Skyrise has done their homework a little bit. Do you think we're going to see this in the foreseeable future, or is this still a science project?
My initial impression was changed by my visit, because a lot of times when people say, "Oh yeah, we're gonna make this aircraft fly by wire," what they're talking about is just a fancy digital autopilot. But Skyrise, they're serious. They have a room full of engineers working on this project, certification experts. They're hoping to get a supplemental type certificate for the R66 Skyrise One package in 2025 and start delivering. And the price doesn't seem too unreasonable. It's about $400,000 on top of the 1.4 million price of a typically equipped R66. So I think that they're probably going to achieve certification of this system sooner than any of these eVTOL aircraft are going to get their entire aircraft certified.
It's an interesting approach that they're essentially modifying a proven aircraft like the R66, which in many ways is in some ways more impressive to retrofit something like this, but it's also much more practical. I think instead of a clean sheet with whole new propulsion systems and even aerodynamics, in this case, they're simplifying what we know, which I think they deserve some credit for. Now, you're the perfect person to cover this story, I feel like, because you know the technology, you've flown fly-by-wire business jets, but in addition to all that jet time, you recently added the helicopter rating, I know. Like me, you were a longtime fixed-wing pilot. You finally succumbed to that rotary wing disease. You've got a great article on this, which we'll link to in the show notes. But overall, would you say it was harder or easier than you expected to get that certificate?
It wasn't harder necessarily. It's helicopter flying is so different from fixed wing. You have to kind of, the way I like to characterize it, put on a different hat, because you can't use your muscle memory from flying an airplane in a helicopter. It's just such a completely different environment. But one of the interesting things I observed from this experience is that I didn't realize how much all of the sensory input is important for helicopter flying. In other words, your peripheral vision, even the sounds, having to kind of incorporate that all into three different controls that you're trying to manipulate all at the same time to make it do what you want. And it gave me a real insight into why, for people who learn to fly helicopters first, flying into instrument conditions is so difficult for them. And I think it's because they have to switch off those senses that they rely on for most of their helicopter flying. And it's very difficult to do that if you're not used to flying in the clouds. So from that standpoint, it was really eye-opening, and I had to force myself to accept all of that input and incorporate it into my flying. But that said, what I really came to appreciate is that flying a helicopter, more so than flying an airplane, puts me into a flow state a lot quicker, because you have to focus 150% on what you're doing. You can't not pay attention to that machine.
That's a great way to sum it up. I've often felt that way flying helicopters. You have no choice but to give it your undivided attention. You had a great line in your article. You wrote, "Controlling a helicopter is all about letting go." Now, that would seem in some ways to contradict what you just said, but I think it actually reinforces it. So tell us what you mean by that.
So I've had this pointed out to me by people I've flown with in helicopters before I started taking lessons. And my friend Pete Gillies, who's a well-known, famous helicopter pilot and instructor, I flew with him a few times years ago, and he's the one who inspired me to do this finally. But what he was trying to explain is that, well, first of all, anytime you talk to somebody who's not a helicopter pilot about helicopter flying, the first thing they say is, "Oh, it's kind of like dancing on the head of a pin, isn't it?" And that's exactly not what it's like. You're at the same time that you are manipulating these three controls to try to get the helicopter to do what you want. if you think about it too much and focus too much on trying to make the control do exactly what you want, you'll quickly find that you're over controlling and getting out of control. And if the helicopter, let's say you're trying to hover, starts to bank side to side or move back and forth and go up and down, the more you try to counter each of those motions, the worse it's going to get. And you end up having to settle down by letting the helicopter settle itself down, which it does very well. And you quickly learn that if you just kind of relax a little bit, the helicopter will just be in a state where it's not feeling like it's out of control. It's very hard to describe until you can feel it, but it really does work.
I think it's great advice. I think the 2 points actually work together quite well. On the one hand, your brain is going a million miles an hour. You're so alert to all the different sensations of the seat of the pants, the sound, as you said, but you almost need to run that through a gearing ratio, because when it goes through your hands to the controls, it needs to be about a quarter speed, because if you're trying to make all those inputs, as you said, you're going to over control. So when in doubt, do less, or make a small correction and then take it out. So it's great advice. I know you learned to fly in the Cabry G2, which is a modern new training helicopter, not so similar to your typical Robinson R22 that listeners might be familiar with. It's a great looking helicopter. So tell us what's unique about that.
I like a lot of the design features of the Cabry G2. Bruno Gimbal is a brilliant engineer who worked for Airbus helicopters for many years and then started his own company. And he took a fresh approach to a trading helicopter, I think. And a lot of his design goals revolve around making a safe helicopter that's fairly easy to fly and very robust, because he knows that the training environment is rough on helicopters. It does have a finestron, which is not a conventional tail rotor, but it's a shrouded tail rotor, which is found on many Airbus helicopter types and the new Leonardo AW09. But what that gives you is superior control in a wider envelope. For example, up to 35 knots, you just don't have a problem with a tailwind in the G2. And here's one example of the design that I think is very interesting. And I actually had a good conversation with Bruno about this and asked him why he did it. Most piston helicopters, you need some way to apply tension to the drive belt between the engine and the transmission. And some helicopters just simply use an actuator that pushes against a bearing that pushes on the belt to tighten it up and hold it there. And that requires a lot of pressure by the actuator. The bearings can wear out. And it works, obviously, because a lot of companies do that. But Bruno felt that he could come up with something better. And he studied it, all the different methods. And finally, he asked Lycoming if they could build his engine with a special mounting scheme. And in fact, he told me that everybody said that's a crazy idea. But what he did was design the engine so there's only 2 mounts, and the engine can swing on the mounts. So when you want to apply, turn on the clutch to tighten up the belt, the engine swings down just by the weight of the engine and pushes on the mechanism that holds the belt tight. It's a simple design. The parts are a lot smaller and lighter, and it works very well. It's a good example of his design philosophy.
So let's fast forward 10 years, and let's say that some of this new flight control technology, like we were talking about with Skyrise, is now available on a Cabry G2 and a Robinson R66 and R44, and maybe even airplanes. Do you think that takes away any of the fun and challenge of flying these aircraft? Or does it make it more fun because it's easier and safer and maybe even more reliable?
I'm glad you brought that up because I know there's going to be purists who insist that, by God, they're not going to take away my cyclic and my collective and my pedals. And yes, you're right. Skyrise is working on fixed wing aircraft applications too. So this could become widespread. But it's a tough question. I fly tailwheels also, and tailwheels are fun. But why were airplanes designed with nose wheels? Well, the fact is that a lot more people are capable of flying an airplane with a nose wheel safely than can do so with tailwheels. That's just a fact. And it greatly opened up the potential pilot pool and increased safety. So these flight control systems will dramatically improve safety. And I think if you can improve safety in any activity, it can still be plenty of fun. But if people aren't dying left and right, and we both know friends who have died in aircraft, I think that can't be anything but a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analogy with the Taildragger. I love them too, but part of the reason they're niche is they're harder. And as a flight instructor of mine once said, not crashing is an awful lot of fun. So worth keeping in mind for some of us who are purists at heart. Matt, let's take a quick break and we'll be back with some more questions.
Earn all your pilot ratings and keep your flying skills sharp with Sporty's Pilot Training Plus. This all-inclusive membership unlocks Sporty's complete library of award-winning video courses so you can learn anywhere you have your phone, tablet, or laptop. For one annual fee, you get access to over $1,500 in courses, a smart investment in your flying career. Plus, enjoy free shipping every day of the year at sporties.com and apply for one of our 3 annual flight training scholarships. Learn more at sporties.com/pilot training. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Matt Thurber, who, in addition to writing about new technology in helicopters, has spent decades covering aviation safety trends. Matt, we talk a lot about the difference on this show and in the general aviation media about the safety record for airlines and general aviation and how different they are. But to me, the more interesting comparison is business jets compared to pistons and even turboprops to some extent. Why do you think business jets, not so much airlines, have such a better safety record? Is it the engines themselves? Is it 2 pilots, better training, better procedures, something else? What's the driver there?
I think the big driver is better training and procedures when they're observed. I just look back to my own pilot training experience. When I first learned to fly, it was pretty slapdash. And I didn't learn about some important safety topics until much, much later. And you shouldn't have to wait until you get your first professional pilot job to be taught about important safety elements like proper flight planning and proper performance planning. And I think that has been the case for a long time, but I'm encouraged to see that many, many flight schools, and I'm sure Sporty's Academy is like this, start pilots out on the right foot and start with safety considerations, and they're teaching their pilots, you've got to plan your flight properly. You've got to do weight and balance every time. And here are standard operating procedures that we found work really well. The problem is that our system lacks any kind of good follow-up mechanism to make sure pilots keep doing this, or if they don't know how to, that they learn to. And there's been some recent accidents that keep highlighting just how badly trained some pilots are. If we could work on that more, I think it would have a fairly beneficial effect.
It does seem like in lots of GA, the insurance companies are the ultimate safety regulator, that the flight review every 2 years can be pretty basic, can even be just a pencil whip. But as you get into more sophisticated airplanes, it's the insurance companies that drive your training. And I think not coincidentally, that tends to be where the accident record gets better as you get into high performance aircraft, even single engine turboprops. that's where the insurance underwriter has more of a play, and that's where the training gets to be a little bit more significant. So some good lessons, I think, for the lighter end of GA to learn there. One other topic that's been floated, I know, on this recently is safety management systems, SMS. It's a hot topic with the FAA right now. They've recently mandated that for many Part 135 operators. And there's some talk that those may come even further down to some flight schools and other operators. Do you think these make a difference in safety, or is this just box checking and paperwork?
It's both. Like anything, there are people and companies who are very big on compliance. And in fact, much of what they've been doing, you could characterize it as a safety management system already. And they don't need a formal version of it. But then there's also lots of people and companies who either box check or just completely ignore any kind of procedural safety program. And how do you get to those people? Do you force them to do an SMS? They'll be forced into it, but unless they change their attitude about safety, I don't see the SMS program being that helpful. They're going to be resentful, and they're not going to really want to do what you actually have to do to make SMS successful.
Yeah, the challenge for GA pilots, I think, is to learn the best lessons from the airlines, but retain some of the flexibility that we have as Part 91 operators. So maybe try to adhere to the same training standards of train twice a year, have SOPs, use those procedures that have proven to be good without getting completely boxed into just checking the boxes, as you mentioned. And that's difficult, but I think maybe the ultimate balancing act for an individual operator in GA. Do you think technology will help here? We've talked about Skyrise flight control, but there's lots of other things out there, new engines, new autopilots. Does technology really make a difference in the safety record, or is it mostly come down to the pilot because we can find ways to outthink the technology?
The technology definitely can help. Just a great example, the level button on Garmin and other autopilots these days, that's a fantastic safety tool. And I'd love to hear some stories from people who've used it, because you don't see much discussion about it, but I think it's a fantastic safety aid, and it's simple, easy to understand, and it can get you out of trouble in a lot of situations. The problem with technology is that it's just so compelling. We've probably all seen pictures or flown with somebody. You get in the airplane and they have a beautiful GPS and moving map on their cockpit displays, and then they're running 3 or 4 iPads all at the same time. It's like, you don't need that many moving maps, do you? And it's not going to help. But there's so many cool new products that can help, but you have to really learn how they work and understand how they work, and not just jump in the airplane and assume that it's going to help you.
All right, Matt, we always end this podcast with a lightning round called Ready to Copy. I'll ask some questions on a wide range of topics, and you read back with your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
I'm ready.
You've flown a lot of airplanes across your career. What is the most underrated model? Something that was a real joy to fly, but isn't a household name, maybe?
Tough question. Boy, I could categorize that. Citation XLS is an excellent performing airplane, easy to fly, very popular, but I think it is underrated. In the lighter aircraft market, boy, it's hard to pin down one aircraft that meets the term underrated. Maybe I'll have to get back with this one.
Fair enough. On some of those test flights, I know you've flown with a heads-up display, often in some high-end business jets. Do you think this technology has a place in the light GA flight deck, or is it mostly a nice-to-have luxury tool?
Anything that can get your eyes looking outside while still presenting the information you need is going to help. And I think head-up displays could definitely help with light GA flying.
How big of a threat is GPS jamming and spoofing? This is a topic you've covered in AIN in recent issues. It sounds scary. Is it something pilots in the U.S. should be worried about?
Absolutely, because we become so dependent on GPS, and until we have some kind of useful alternative beyond just going back to VOR DME, it's so easy to disrupt GPS signals, and I think it's just going to get worse. We do need an alternative, and I wish there were more work being done on that.
I would say you know more about in-flight connectivity than anyone I know. Do you think Starlink will revolutionize this market in aviation, or is it just another player in a crowded field?
There's an enormous interest in airborne Starlink, and seems to be a lot of take-up, but it's very expensive too. I think, however, that if SpaceX delivers on the hardware that people are demanding, and that its product support organization responds as quickly as people expect in the aviation business, they're going to be a fairly strong competitor for not only air to ground in the US, but SATCOM all over the world.
All right, here's a question I've been waiting to ask you. Why are hangar foam fire suppression systems a bad idea?
This is a favorite topic of mine, but it's just interesting to point out that hangar foam fire suppression systems were designed to help put out or suppress a hangar fire, because presumably you have a hangar full of airplanes with lots of flammable fuel in their tanks. And if something should go wrong, you're going to have a conflagration. Well, we now have a fairly good history of a few decades of having these systems in place, and many communities requiring that they be installed. And so far, it looks like there may have been one situation where the system actually was helping put out a fire. This is, I believe, was a military hangar. But we also have, unfortunately, a handful of people who had died in these foam incidents where the system accidentally goes off when there's not even a fire. And that to me is just unconscionable. If you get trapped in that foam, it's very likely that you're not going to survive. And apparently it's not too hard to set off these systems because it keeps happening once or twice a year. So I don't think these systems are worthwhile. We have the data to support that. And in fact, the National Fire Protection Association doesn't even recommend that they be installed anymore. They changed that last year. The trouble is that local communities have this feeling that it would be a good idea. They impose the requirement on hangar builders, and often it's easier to put in this expensive, useless system than it is to fight with the local authorities.
All right, your bio says you spent 2 summers hunting swordfish from a Super Cub. What is that all about?
I was back in the 1980s. It was my college summer job, and I was working for a commercial fishing boat, and it was a great way to log flight time. What it meant was I would fly over the boat basically and look for the swordfish and guide the boat to the fish, and they would harpoon the fish one at a time. Now, to some people, this sounds kind of aggressively bad way to fish. But if you think about it, we would only go after the really large, mature fish. The way swordfish are typically caught, and you saw this in the movie The Perfect Storm, is with a long line, which is just basically a long rope trailed behind the boat with a bunch of hooks on it. Those long lines catch swordfish of all sizes, babies and mothers and fathers and kids. And to me, that's more akin to a slaughter. So the sword fishing from the air, there's also people who use aircraft for tuna fishing, and it's still done in various parts of the country and the world. But it was an interesting summer job, pretty intense. My longest flight during that time was over 14 hours. luckily I had extra fuel, and I saved up a little bit of money to help pay for college.
What a great way to build time. I hear about a new time building idea. It feels like every month. That's a new one. I've heard the helicopters and tuna boats, but Super Cub sounds like even more fun. All right, Matt, you have covered countless air shows throughout your career all over the world. What is your personal favorite?
I'll have to start with Oshkosh, but I have to mention Aero Friedrichshafen, which to me is kind of like AirVenture Oshkosh elevated to a new level of beautiful indoor facilities, fantastic German food and beer, and just a super convivial atmosphere. It feels a little more intimate just because it's smaller and not so gargantuan as Oshkosh. But if you haven't been to either of them, you must go sometime.
Friedrichshafen is a fun show with a different atmosphere. I agree. It's a fun place to visit. Matt, our last question is always the same on Pilot's Discretion. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
I'm going to go steal an Icon A5 and just go land in a bunch of lakes and rivers and just have some fun, because that's one of the most fun airplanes I've ever flown.
Matt, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, John. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.